Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. More than 2.5 years into the full-scale war, Ukrainian troops are on the defensive. The Ukrainian military announced on October the 2nd that it was pulling troops out of the coal mining town of Vuhledar in a hilltop bastion that had resisted intense attacks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This comes at a delicate time. President Zelensky is promoting his peace plan. Ukrainian troops have entered Russian territory, and Putin and his inner circle in the Kremlin are raising the nuclear rhetoric. How is this decision going to affect Ukraine's strategic position in the war, and what happens next? Well, to throw some light on this, I am joined by Benjamin Tallis. He's Director, Democratic Strategy Initiative. Mr. Tallis, welcome to TVP World, and thank you for taking the time.
Good morning. Pleasure to be back with you.
Great to have you, sir. So, what do we make of this pullback by Ukraine of its troops in an area which is resource rich and which has been defended very well before against Russian attacks since the war started?
Well, as you say, it has been defended valiantly. This was clearly a strategically important target for the Russians. But the progressive weakening of Ukraine's defensive positions, and particularly the use of glide bombs, the extensive use of glide bombs that Russia is able to make use of because we are not allowing Ukraine to hit deep into Russia, that made the position ultimately untenable in Vuhledar. What happens next, whether it becomes something like Avdiivka, where the Russians again further advance, or more like Bakhmut, where after taking a strategically important town, they fail to further progress, depends on the strength of the Ukrainian positions to the north and to the west. And we'll only truly see that once we see Russia trying to probe those areas. But again, this use of glide bombs extensively makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to defend.
And it seems as though the supply of Russian glide bombs is endless. They seem to be using very old stock, which is still doing the job very effectively for the Russians. Now, do you think this is going to move the needle? In other words, is the US going to change its stance on the use of its weaponry on Russian soil?
I'm not sure this will be the thing that does it, because we've seen a series of strategically important towns or significant towns being taken on the Eastern Front, where there's been a creeping Russian advance for many months now, at great cost to Russia, it must be emphasized. And once again, the brutal Russian way of war becomes apparent as they're willing to throw wave after wave of infantry at the Ukrainian guns and don't seem to care about losing them. And manpower is not an unlimited resource for Russians, nor ultimately are the glide bombs, even though there's a lot of them and they can continue to make use of them further. But what would really make the difference is, of course, being able to hit the Russian bombers, to target the archer, not the arrow, as they say. And that's where we've still not actually managed to make a difference as the West. But of course, Ukraine is producing its own weapons, and that's a big part of the support that Ukraine is now asking for, including as part of President Zelensky's victory plan, is to boost Ukrainian production of their own weapons, which of course they wouldn't need the kind of permissions to use deep inside Russia to hit the bombers at their bases that Ukraine needs for when using Western weapons.
Understood. What about the fighter jets that Ukraine has, and from what we understand are going to be airborne shortly? How much of a game changer are those going to be?
Well, they're extremely useful, but in terms of a real game changer, you need enough of them across the whole front and to make a significant difference. It also depends which kind of radar they're using and the supply of long-range missiles that they have, if they are to push back the Russian bombers to a range where they can't use the glide bombs as effectively. And there are questions over that as to how many of the requisite missiles and the types of radars that Ukraine is actually getting. So we'll really have to see once the F-16s start making their presence felt, exactly what difference that makes. They can be used for a variety of missions, which can provide or change the balance of air dominance in a particular area. But again, in terms of the scale that Ukraine needs, it's not been provided. And this is the strategic failure of the West, is to undersupply Ukraine back at a time when it could have made a real difference in 2022, but also now when it could still help stabilize the front line and give Ukraine the chance to actually get back on its feet and prepare for future attack.
So it seems as though the West is giving too little, too late for most of the time. Now, this takeover of Vuhledar by the Russians, is that going to harden the Russian stance if and when we get to peace talks? In other words, they'll say, well, look, we've got all these strategically significant towns, cities in the region. We're hanging on to them. Thank you very much.
Well, clearly they will try to do that. They'll try to hang on to as much as they can. And as Tallis and others have been very clear about, this is what Russia does. It takes way more than it should, and then holding on to even a part of that would still be some kind of victory. But we can't forget also that Ukraine has taken Russian territory, and the front line in Kursk now seems to have stabilized. The Ukrainians have successfully defended the Russian counteroffensive there. And although they don't necessarily have the combat power in that region to take further Russian territory, it seems unlikely they'll be pushed out unless the Russians really redeploy a large amount of troops, armor, and other equipment there. So there is possibility for trades to be made. And of course, you're right to say that the push for negotiations is coming on now from the West. This is very much in the air. The questions are all about the terms of those negotiations. It's very difficult to understand how many in the West still see Vladimir Putin as a credible negotiating partner, but nonetheless, the push is there. And for me, the key issue is what security guarantees Ukraine would get for any armistice, for any freezing of the conflict, with clearly NATO membership being the best option, both for the Ukraine and for Europe.
Yes, absolutely. And whether Putin would abide by any agreement is yet another question. Now, you mentioned that manpower, Russian manpower, is not limitless, and their losses have been enormous on the battlefield. How is that being received back at home?
Well, I think if you look at the costs to Russia of finding new soldiers, the amount they're having to pay to entice people to come to what is an increasingly short lifespan on the front line, it's rising significantly, and that tells you they're having trouble recruiting. Also, they will start to approach the end of people that the Russian government doesn't look on very highly. So convicts, people of other ethnicities living in Russia, and we know there's a lot of inequality there. As this starts to come closer to the major population centers of St. Petersburg and Moscow, as families who start to have middle-class aspirations, let's say, start to see their children being potentially called up, this will cause increasing problems for Russia. There's another issue, though, as well, about Russia's critical supply chains and the supply of machine tools to their factories, for example, which a lot of economic experts think is going to run into problems sometime in 2025. So the notion that Russia can simply outlast the West here, I think, is a little bit misguided. And so there would be some incentive also for Vladimir Putin to stop the conflict. The key question for all of us in Europe is what happens next? Is that a time that is given to Russia to rearm, to regenerate its forces and reconstitute its threat to all of us? Or is it a time when we actually get our act together and significantly upgrade our defense and deterrence, including for Ukraine, in a way that would make it impossible for Russia to attack us?
Yes, I mean, although Russia's national capabilities are not endless, it does have the supplies from China and from North Korea in terms of missiles, for example, and tooling from China. So, yeah, it is something that, unfortunately, I believe has the potential to linger for a while. But nonetheless, as you say, not forever. Now, the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk, strategically, what has that changed, if anything?
Well, it reminded a lot of people in the West that the Ukrainians have agency in this conflict, that they're not mere pawns of Western supply only or of Russian attrition on the other hand. They really took back the initiative, and I think they gave a morale boost to their population. They put Russian strategic thinking on the back foot. And we've seen that Russia has had to move 40,000 or so troops from elsewhere on the front to deal with this, to prevent further incursions into Russia. So both tactically and strategically, there were advantages to doing this. Now, of course, some people have questioned whether Ukraine really had the resources to be able to do this. But in terms of that morale boost and in terms of reminding the West that Ukraine will fight, regardless of the level of Western support, because they believe in their victory. That was, I think, an extremely useful thing to do, and allowed President Zelensky's victory plan tour to the United States to have greater credibility. That comes alongside the Ukrainian upgrade in their own defense industry and asking for further funding for that, including via joint ventures with Western companies that would allow them to continue to produce high-quality weapons that they can use. And all of that together, I think, put the Ukrainians in a better position to negotiate with the West about terms of potential negotiation with the Russians.
Understood. Well, strategically, clearly this has legs. Yes, it has potential. But what about Ukrainian manpower? Clearly, much smaller country. A lot of Ukrainian people of fighting age have left. What's that situation looking like at the moment?
It's a good question, and it's one that many Ukrainians are asking, because at the moment, one of the key issues relates to what's called rotation, or the length of service that Ukrainians are expected to provide in the military. So if you're recruited, then how long would you actually have to serve in fighting units before you're able to return and drop back out of the military? Because, of course, this is a mentally and physically exhausting process, to put it mildly. And the question of morale, if there is seen as no end to that, what initially were perhaps 3-year recruitments, now potentially being extended further, is a significant issue for Ukrainian morale. And what I think we're seeing is also that the fall in support for the full push to victory, so to restoring control over the 1991 borders, which over the last 2 years, the number of Ukrainians supporting that has fallen from about 87% to now around 64%. So still a majority wanting to push for absolute victory, but falling as people see the difficulties of war, as they see their friends and family dying and being injured, and as they see the mental costs of that. And this has affected further recruitment going forward, which also affects the Ukrainian ability to replenish their forces at the front and to rotate units in and out of combat. So I think this is a real issue that Ukraine will need to deal with. But from the West's point of view, this really shows, again, our strategic failure. You mentioned before the allies that are supplying Russia, China, Iran, this axis of evil, if you like. The West hasn't really tried to support Ukraine in a way that would actually go about supporting Ukraine's victory. And again, we could massively outproduce the Russians and even the Chinese if we wanted to on this. We have a higher GDP, we have the defense industrial capacity if we wanted to use it, but we're not using it yet. And so it shows a differing level of will.
Yes, unfortunately so. Mr. Benjamin Tallis, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Do come and see us again soon. Have a good day.
Thanks for having me on. Good to talk. Bye-bye.
Good to talk. Bye-bye now. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.